Hello, Cardinals, and welcome to our next installment of Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake. 10. Vulturizing. After 4 deranged years, Jimmy graduated from Martha Graham with his dingy little degree in problematics. He didn't expect to get a job right away, and in this he was not deceived. For weeks, he'd parcel up his meager credentials, send them out, and then get them back too quickly, sometimes with grease spots and fingerprints from whatever sub-basement level cog had been flipping through them while eating lunch. Then he'd replace the dirty pages and send the package out again. He snared a summer job at the Martha Graham Library, going through old books and earmarking them for destruction, while deciding which should remain on Earth in digital form. But he lost his post halfway through his term because he couldn't bear to throw anything out. After that, he shacked up with his girlfriend of the moment, a conceptual artist and long-haired brunette named Amanda Payne. This name was an invention, and like much about her, her real name was Barb Jones. She'd had to reinvent herself, she told Jimmy, the original Barb having been so bulldozed by her abusive white trash, sugar overdose family that she'd been nothing but a yard sale reject, like a wind chime made of bent forks or a three-legged chair. This had been her appeal for Jimmy, for whom yard sale was in itself an exotic concept. He'd wanted to mend her, do the repairs, freshen up the paint, make her like new. "You have a good heart," she told him, the first time she let her inside her defenses. Revision. Overalls. Amanda had a rundown condo in one of the modules, shared with 2 other artists, both men. The 3 of them were all from the pleblands. They'd gone to Martha Graham on scholarship, and they considered themselves superior to the privileged, weak-spined, degenerate offspring of the compound, such as Jimmy. They'd had to be tough, take it on the chin, battle their way. They claimed a clarity of vision that could only have come from being honed on the grindstone of reality. One of the men had tried suicide, which conferred on him, he implied, a special vantage. The other one had shot a lot of heroin and dealt it too before taking up art instead, or possibly in addition. After the first few weeks, during which he'd found them charismatic, Jimmy had decided these 2 were bullshit technicians, in addition to which they were puffed up snots. The 2 who were not Amanda tolerated Jimmy, but just marginally. In order to ingratiate himself with them, he took a turn in the kitchen now and then. All 3 of the artists sneered at microwaves and were into boiling their own spaghetti. But he wasn't a very good cook. He made the mistake of bringing home a Chicky Knobs bucket of nubbins one night. A franchise had opened around the corner. And the stuff wasn't that bad if you could forget everything you knew about the provenance. And after that, the 2 of them who were not Amanda barely spoke to him. That didn't stop them from speaking to each other. They had lots to say about all kinds of junk they claimed to know something about, and would drone on in an instigated way, delivering themselves of harangues and oblique sermons that were, in fact, Jimmy felt, aimed at himself. According to them, it had been a game over once agriculture was invented 6 or 7,000 years ago. After that, the human experiment was doomed, first to gigantism due to a maxed out food supply, and then to extinction once all the available nutrients had been hoovered up. "You've got the answers," said Jimmy. He'd come to enjoy needling them, because who were they to judge? The artists, who were not sensitized to irony, said that the correct analysis was one thing, but correct solutions were another, and the lack of the latter did not invalidate the former. Anyway, maybe there weren't any solutions. Human society, they claimed, was a sort of monster, its main byproducts being corpses and rubble. It never learned. It made the same cretinous mistakes over and over, trading short-term gain for long-term pain. It was like a giant slug eating its way relentlessly through all the other bioforms on the planet, grinding up life on Earth and shitting it out the backside in the form of pieces of manufactured and soon-to-be obsolete plastic junk. "Like your computers," murmured Jimmy, "the ones you do your art on." "Soon," said the artist, ignoring him, "there would be nothing left but a series of long subterranean tubes covering the surface of the planet. The air and light inside them would be artificial, the ozone and oxygen layers of planet Earth having been totally destroyed. People would creep along through this tubing, single file, stark naked, their only view the asshole of the one before them in line, their urine and excrement flowing down through the vents in the floor until they were randomly selected by a digitized mechanism at which point they would be sucked into a side tunnel, ground up, and fed to the others through a series of nipple-shaped appendages on the inside of the tube. The system would be self-sustaining and perpetual, and would serve everybody right. So I guess that would do away with war, said Jimmy, and we'd all have very thick kneecaps. But what about sex? Not so easy, packed into a tube like that. Amanda shot him a dirty look. Dirty but complicit. You could tell the same question had occurred to her. Amanda herself wasn't very talkative. She was an image person, not a word person, she said. She claimed to think in pictures, and that was fine with Jimmy because a bit of synesthesia never went amiss. So what do you see when I do this? He'd ask her in their earliest, most ardent days. Flowers, she'd say, 2 or 3, pink. What about this? What do you see? Red flowers, red and purple, 5 or 6. How about this? Oh, baby, I love you. Neon. Afterwards, she would sigh and tell him, that was a whole bouquet. He was susceptible to those invisible flowers of hers. They were, after all, a tribute to his talents. She had a very fine ass, too, and her tits were real. But, and he'd noticed this early, she was a little flinty around the eyes. Amanda was from Texas originally. She claimed to be able to remember the place before it dried up and blew away, in which case, thought Jimmy, she was about 10 years older than she made out. She'd been working for some time on a project called vulture sculptures. The idea was to take a truckload of large dead animal parts to vacant fields or the parking lots of abandoned factories and arrange them in the shape of words. Wait until the vultures had descended and were tearing them apart, and then photograph the whole scene from a helicopter. She'd attracted a lot of publicity at first, as well as a few sacks of hate mail and death threats from the God's gardeners and from isolated crazies. One of the letters was from Jimmy's old dorm roommate Bernice, who'd cranked her rhetorical volume up considerably. Then some wrinkly, corrupt old patron who'd made a couple of fortunes out of a string of heart parts farms had given her a hefty grant, under the illusion that what she was doing was razor-sharp, cutting edge. This was good, said Amanda, because without that chunk of change, she would have had to abandon her artwork. Helicopters cost a lot of money. And then, of course, there was the security clearance. The corpsmen were really anal about airspace, she said. They suspected everyone of wanting to nuke stuff from above, and you practically had to let them climb into your underpants before they'd let you fly anywhere in a hired copter, unless you were some graft-ridden prince from a compound, that is. The word she vulturized, her term, had to have 4 letters. She gave a great deal of thought to them. Each letter of the alphabet had a vibe, a plus or minus charge, so the words had to be selected with care. Vulturizing brought them to life was her concept, and then it killed them. It was a powerful process, like watching God thinking, she'd said on a net Q&A. So far, she'd done pain, a pun on her last name, as she pointed out in a chat room interview, and whom, and then guts. She was having a hard time during the summer of Jimmy because she was blocked on the next word. Finally, when Jimmy didn't think he could stand any more boiled spaghetti and the sight of Amanda staring into space while chewing on a strand of her hair no longer brought on an attack of lust and rapture, he landed a job. He was with an outfit called AnooYoo, a minor compound situated so close to one of the more dilapidated pleblands that it might as well have been in it. Not too many people would work there if they had other choices, was what he felt on the day he went for the interview, which might have accounted for the slightly abject manner of the interviewers. He could bet they'd been rejected by a dozen or 2 job hunters before him. Well, he beamed at them telepathically. I may not be what you had in mind, but at least I'm cheap. What had impressed them, said the interviewers, there were 2 of them, a woman and a man, was his senior dissertation on self-help books of the 20th century. One of their core products, they told him, was the improvement items. Not books anymore, of course, but the DVDs, the CD-ROMs, the websites, and so forth. It wasn't these instructionals, as such, that generated the cash surplus, they explained. It was the equipment and the alternative medicines you needed in order to get the optimum effect. Mind and body went hand in hand, and Jimmy's job would be to work on the mind end of things. In other words, the promotionals. What people want is perfection, said the man, in themselves. But they need the steps to be pointed out, said the woman. In a simple order, said the man. With encouragement, said the woman, and a positive attitude. They like to hear about the before and after, said the man. It's the art of the possible, but with no guarantees, of course. You showed great insight into the process, the woman said. In your dissertation, we found it very mature. If you know one century, you know 'em all, said the man. But the adjectives change, said Jimmy. Nothing's worse than last year's adjectives. Exactly, said the man, as if Jimmy had just solved the riddle of the universe in one blinding flashbulb of light. He got a finger-cracking handshake from the man, and the woman he got a warm but vulnerable smile, which left him wondering whether or not she was married. The pay at AnooYoo wasn't that great, but there might be other advantages. That evening he told Amanda Payne about his good fortune. She'd been carping on money lately, or not carping, but she'd inserted a few pointed remarks about pulling your own weight into the prolonged and intense silences that were her specialty, so he thought she'd be pleased. Things hadn't been that good in the sack lately, ever since the Chicky Knobs blunder, in fact. Maybe they'd pick up now, in time for a heartfelt, plangent, and action-filled finale. Already he was rehearsing his exit lines. I'm not what you need. You deserve better. I'll ruin your life. And so forth. But it was best to work up to these things, so he elaborated on his new job. Now we'll be able to bring home the bacon, he concluded in what he hoped was a winsome but responsible tone. Amanda wasn't impressed. You're going to work where? Was her comment. Point being, as it unfolded, that AnooYoo was a collection of cesspool denizens who existed for no other reason than to prey on the phobias and void the bank accounts of the anxious and gullible. It seemed that Amanda, until recently, had a friend who signed up for an AnooYoo 5-month plan, touted as being able to cure depression, wrinkles, and insomnia all at the same time, and who pushed herself over the edge, actually over the windowsill, of her 10-story up apartment on some kind of South American tree bark. I could always turn them down, said Jimmy when this tale had been told. I could join the ranks of the permanently unemployed, or, hey, I could go on being a kept man like now. Joke, don't kill me. Amanda was more silent than ever for the next few days, and then she told him she'd unblocked herself artistically. The next key word for the vulture sculpture had come to her. And what's that? Said Jimmy, trying to sound interested. She looked at him speculatively. Love, she said. AnooYoo. Jimmy moved into the junior apartment provided for him in the AnooYoo compound. Bedroom in an alcove, cramped kitchenette, reproduction 1950s furniture. As a dwelling place, it was only a small step up from his dorm room at Martha Graham, but at least there was less insect life. He discovered quite soon that, corporately speaking, he was a drudge and a helot. He was to cudgel his brains and spend 10-hour days wandering the labyrinths of the thesaurus and cranking out the verbiage. Then those above would grade his offerings, hand them back for revision, hand them back again. What we want is more, is less. That's not quite it. But with time, he improved, whatever that meant. Cosmetic creams, workout equipment, jolt bars to build your musclescape into a breathtaking marvel of sculpted granite. Pills to make you fatter, thinner, hairier, balder, whiter, browner, blacker, yellower, sexier, and happier. It was his task to describe and extol, to present the vision of what, oh so easily, could come to be. Hope and fear, desire and revulsion, these were his stocks in trade. On these he rang his changes. Once in a while he'd make up a word, tensicity, vibraciousness, pheromonimal. But he never once got caught. His proprietor liked those kinds of words and the small prints on packages because they sounded scientific and had a convincing effect. He should have been pleased by his successes with these verbal fabrications, but instead he was depressed by it. The memos that came from above telling him he'd done a good job meant nothing to him because they'd been dictated by semi-literates. All they proved was that no one at AnooYoo was capable of appreciating how clever he had been. He came to understand why serial killers sent helpful clues to the police. His social life was, for the first time in many years, a zero. He hadn't been stranded in such a sexual desert since he was 8. Amanda Payne shimmered in the past like a lost lagoon, its crocodiles for the moment forgotten. Why had he abandoned her so casually? Because he'd been looking forward to the next in the series, but the woman interviewer from AnooYoo about whom he'd had such hopes was never seen again, and the other women he encountered at the office or in the AnooYoo bars were either mean-minded, eye of the target sharks, or so emotionally starved even Jimmy avoided them as if they were quagmires. He was reduced to flirting with wait persons, and even then they turned a cold shoulder. They'd seen fast-talking youngsters like him before. They knew he had no status. In the company cafe, he was a new boy, alone once more, starting over. He took to eating soyo burgers in the compound mall or taking out a greasy box of chicky knobs nubbins to munch on while working overtime at his computer terminal. Every week there was a compound social barbecue, a comprehensive rat fuck that all employees were expected to attend. These were dire occasions for Jimmy. He lacked the energy to work the crowd. He was fresh out of innocuous drivel. He loitered on the edges, gnawing on a burned soy dog and silently ripping apart everyone within eyesight. Saggy boobs, ran the thought balloon in his head. Bun-faced tofu brain, thumb-sucking poster boy, fridge woman, Sella's granny, wobble-bummed bovine, bladder-headed jerk. He got an occasional email from his father, an e-birthday card perhaps, a few days later than his real birthday, something with dancing pagoons on it as if he were still 11. "Happy birthday, Jimmy, may all your dreams come true," Ramona would write him, chatty, dutiful message. No baby brother for him yet, she'd say, but they were still working on it. He did not wish to visualize the hormone-sodden, potion-ridden, gel-slathered details of such work. If nothing natural happened soon, she said, they'd try something else. From one of the agencies, Infantaid, Fotility, Perfectababe, one of those. Things had changed a lot in the field since Jimmy came along. Came along as if he hadn't actually been born, but had just sort of dropped by for a visit. She was doing her research because, of course, they wanted the best for their money. Terrific, thought Jimmy. They'd have a few trial runs, and if the kids from those didn't measure up, they'd recycle them for the parts until at last they got something that fit all their specs. Perfect in every way, not only a math whiz, but beautiful as the dawn. And then they'd load this hypothetical wonder kid up with their bloated expectations until the poor tyke burst under the strain. Jimmy didn't envy him. He envied him. Ramona invited Jimmy for the holidays, but he had no wish to go, so he pleaded over work, which was the truth in a way, as he'd come to see his job as a challenge. How outrageous could he get in the realm of fatuous neologism and still achieve praise? After a while, he was granted a promotion, and then he could buy new toys. He got himself a better DVD player, a gym suit that cleaned itself overnight due to a sweat-eating bacteria, a shirt that displayed email on its sleeve while giving him a little nudge every time he had message, shoes that changed color to match his outfits, a talking toaster. Well, it was company. "Jimmy, your toast is done." He upgraded to a better apartment. Now that he was climbing up the ladder, he found a woman, and then another one, and another one after that. He no longer thought of these women as girlfriends. Now they were lovers. They were all married, or the equivalent, looking for a chance to sneak around on their husbands or partners to prove they were still young, or else to get even, or else they were wounded and wanted consolation, or they simply felt ignored. There was no reason he couldn't have several of them at once, as long as he was conscientious about his scheduling. At first, he enjoyed the rushed impromptu visits, the secrecy, the sound of Velcro ripped open in haste, the slow tumbling onto the floor, though he figured out pretty soon that he was an extra for these lovers, not to be taken seriously, but instead to be treasured like some child's free gift dug out of a cereal box, colorful and delightful but useless, the joker among the twos and threes they'd been dealt in their real lives. He was merely a pastime for them, as they were for him, though for them there was more at stake, a divorce or a spate of non-routine violence at the least, a dollop of verbal uproar if they got caught. One good thing, they never told him to grow up. He suspected they kind of liked it that he hadn't. None of them wanted to leave their husbands and settle down with him or to want to run away to the plebe lands with him. Not that this was very possible anymore. The plebes lands were said to have become ultra-hazardous for those who didn't know their way around out there, and the Corsicore security at the compound gates was tighter than ever. Garage. So this was the rest of his life. It felt like a party to which he'd been invited, but in an address he couldn't actually locate. Someone must be having fun at this life of his, only right at the moment, it wasn't him. His body had always been easy to maintain, but now he had to work at it. If he skipped the gym, he'd develop flab overnight where none was before. His energy level was sinking, and he had to watch his Jolt bar intake. Too many steroids could shrink your dick, and though it said on the package that this problem had been fixed due to the addition of some unpronounceable patented compound, he'd written enough package copy not to believe this. His hair was getting sparser around the temples, despite the 6-week AnooYoo follicle regrowth course he'd done. He ought to have known it was a scam. He'd put together the ads for it. But they were such good ads that he'd convinced even himself. He found himself wondering what shape Crake's hairline was in. Crake had graduated early, done post-grad work, and then written his own ticket. He was at Rejuvenescence now, one of the most powerful compounds of them all, and climbing fast. At first, the two of them had continued to keep in touch by email. Crake spoke vaguely of a special project he was doing, something white hot. He'd been given carte blanche, he said. The sun showed out of his bum as far as the top brass were concerned. Jimmy should come and visit him sometime, and he'd show him around. What was it that Jimmy was doing again? Jimmy countered with the suggestion that they play chess. Crake's next news was that Uncle Pete had died suddenly. Some virus. Whatever it was had gone through him like shit through a goose. It was like watching pink sorbet on a barbecue. Instant meltdown. Sabotage was suspected, but nothing had been proved. Were you there? Asked Jimmy. In a manner of speaking, said Crake. Jimmy pondered this and then asked if anyone else had caught the virus. Crake said no. As time went by, the intervals between their messages became longer and longer. The thread connecting them stretched thinner. What did they have to say to each other? Jimmy's word surf job was surely one that Crake would despise, though affably, and Crake's pursuits might not be something Jimmy could understand anymore. He realized he was thinking of Crake as someone he used to know. Increasingly, he was restless. Even sex was no longer what it had once been, though he was still as addicted to it as ever. He felt jerked around by his own dick, as if the rest of him was merely an inconsequential knob that happened to be attached to one end of it. Maybe the thing would be happier if left to roam on its own. On the evenings, when none of his lovers had managed to lie to their husbands or equivalents well enough to spend time with him, he might go to a movie at the mall just to convince himself he was part of a group of other people. Or he'd watch the news. More plagues, more famines, more floods, more insect or microbe or small mammal outbreaks, more droughts, more chicken shit boy soldier wars in distant countries. Why was everything so much like itself? There were the usual political assassinations out there in the plebes, the usual strange accidents, the unexplained disappearances, or there were sex scandals. Sex scandals always got the newscasters excited. For a while, it was sports coaches and little boys. And then there was a wave of adolescent girls found locked in garages. These girls were said, by those who had done the locking, to be working as maids and to have been brought from their squalid countries of origin for their own good. Being locked in the garage was for the protection of these girls, said the men. Respectable men, accountants, lawyers, merchants dealing in patio furniture, who were dragged into court to defend themselves. Frequently, their wives backed them up. These girls, said the wives, had been practically adopted and were treated almost like one of the family. Jimmy loved those two words, practically, almost. The girls themselves told other stories, not all of them credible. They'd been drugged, said some. They'd been made to perform obscene contortions in unlikely venues, such as pet shops. They'd been rowed across the Pacific Ocean on rubber rafts. They'd been smuggled in container ships hidden in mounds of soy products. They'd been made to commit sacrilegious acts involving reptiles. On the other hand, some of these girls seemed content with their situation. The garages were nice, they said, better than what they'd had at home. The meals were regular, the work wasn't too hard. It was true they weren't paid and they couldn't go out anywhere, but there was nothing different or surprising to them about that. One of these girls, found locked in a garage in San Francisco at the home of a prosperous pharmacist, said she used to be in movies, but she was glad she'd been sold to her mister, who had seen her on the net and had felt sorry for her and had come in person to fetch her and had paid a lot of cash to rescue her, and had flown with her on a plane across the ocean, and had promised to send her to school once her English was good enough. She refused to say anything negative about the man. She appeared to be simple, truthful, and sincere. When asked why the garage was locked, she said it was so nobody bad could get in. When asked what she did in there, she said she studied English and watched TV. When asked how she felt about her captor, she said she would always be grateful to him. The prosecution failed to shake her testimony, and the guy got off scot-free, although he was ordered to send her to school immediately. She said she wanted to study child psychology. There was a close-up of her face, of her beautiful cat's face, her delicate smile. Jimmy thought he recognized her. He froze her image and then unpacked his old printout, the one from when he was 14. He'd kept it with him through all of his moves, almost like a family photo, out of sight but never discarded, tucked in among his Martha Graham Academy transcripts. He compared the faces, but a lot of time had gone by since then, and that girl, the 8-year-old in the printout, must be 17, 18, 19 by now, and the one from the news broadcast seemed a lot younger, but the look was the same blend of innocence and contempt and understanding. It made him feel lightheaded, precariously balanced, as if he was standing on the edge of a cliff above a rock-filled gorge, and it would be dangerous for him to look down. Gripless. The Corsicore had never lost sight of Jimmy. During his time at Martha Graham, they'd hauled him in regularly 4 times a year for what they called their little talks. They asked him the same questions they'd already asked him a dozen times, just to see if they got the same answer. "I don't know," was the safest thing Jimmy could think to say, which most of the time was accurate enough. After a while, they'd taken to showing him pictures, stills from buttonhole snoop cameras or black and whites that looked as if they'd been pulled off security video cams at Cleveland banks or ATMs, or news channel footage of this or that, demonstrations, riot executions. The game was to see if he recognized any of the faces. They had him wired up, so even if he pretended ignorance, they'd catch the spikes of neural electricity he wouldn't be able to control. He kept waiting for the Happy Cup of Caper in Maryland to turn up, the one with his mother in it. He dreaded that, but it never showed. He hadn't received any foreign postcards in a long time. After he'd gone to work at AnooYoo, the corpsmen appeared to have forgotten about him, but no, they were just playing out the rope, seeing if he or else the other side, meaning his mother, would use his new position, his dollop of extra freedom, to try to make contact again. After a year or so, there was the familiar knocking at the door. He always knew it was them because they never used the intercom first. They must have some kind of bypass, not to mention the door code. "Hello, Jimmy. How you doing? We just need to ask you a few questions, see if you can help us out a little here." "Sure, be glad to." "Attaboy." And so it went. In, his 5th year at AnooYoo, they finally hit pay dirt. He'd been looking at the pictures for a couple of hours by then, shots of boondocks war in some arid mountain range across the ocean, with close-ups of dead mercenaries, male and female, a bunch of aid workers getting mauled by the starving in one of those dusty famines far away, a row of heads on poles, that was in the ex-Argentine, said the Corsicore, though they didn't say whose heads they were or how they'd got onto the poles. Several women going through a supermarket checkout, all in sunglasses, a dozen bodies sprawled on the floor after a raid on a God's Gardener's safe house. That outfit was outlawed now. And one of them sure looked a lot like his old roomie, the incendiary Bernice. He said so, being a good boy, and got a pat on the back, but obviously they'd known that already because they weren't interested. He felt bad about Bernice. She'd been a nut and a nuisance, but she hadn't deserved to die like that. A lineup of mugshots from a Sacramento prison, the driver's license photo from a suicide car bomber. But if the car had blown up, how'd they come by the license? 3 pantyless waitresses from a plebeian no-touching nookie bar. They threw that in for fun, and it does cause a waiver on the neural monitor. Unnatural if it hadn't, and smiles and chuckles all around. A riot scene Jimmy recognized from a movie remake of Frankenstein. They always put in a few tricks like that to keep him on his toes. And then more mugshots. "Nope," said Jimmy. Nope, nothing. And then came what looked like a routine execution. No horseplay, no prisoners breaking free, no foul language. By this, Jimmy knew before he saw her that it was a woman they were erasing. And then came the figure in the loose gray prison clothing shuffling along, hair tied back, wrists handcuffed, the female guard to either side, the blindfold. Shooting by spray gun it was going to be. No need for a firing squad. One spray gun would have done it, but they kept the old custom. 5 in a row, so no single executioner need lose sleep over whose virtual bullet had killed first. Shooting was only for treason. Otherwise it was gas or hanging or the brain frizz. A man's voice, words coming from the outside, the shot. The corpsmen had the sound turned down because they wanted Jimmy to concentrate on the visuals. But it must have been in order because now the guards were taking off the blindfold. Panned a close-up. The woman was looking right at him, right out of the frame, a blue-eyed look, direct, defiant, patient, wounded, but no tears. And then the sound came suddenly up. Goodbye. Remember, killer. I love you. Don't let me down. No question. It was his mother. Jimmy was shocked by how old she'd become. Her skin was lined, her mouth withered. Was it hard living she'd been doing on the run, or was it the bad treatment? How long had she been in prison in their grip? What had they been doing to her? Wait, he wanted to yell, but that was that. Pullback shot, eyes covered again, zap, zap, zap. Bad aim, red spurts, they almost took her head off. Long shot of her crumpling to the ground. Anything there, Jimmy? Nope. Sorry, nothing. How could she have foreseen that he'd be looking? They must have picked up the heartbeat, the surge of energy, after a few neutral questions. Want a coffee? Need a leak? One of them said. So who was this killer? Killer, Jimmy said. He began to laugh. Killer was a skunk. There, he'd done it. Another betrayal. He couldn't help himself. Not a nice guy, eh? Some sort of biker? No, said Jimmy, laughing more. You don't get it. A skunk, a rakunk, an animal. He put his head down on his 2 fists, weeping with laughter. Why did she have to drag Killer into it? So he'd know it was really her, that's why. So he'd believe her. But what did she mean about letting her down? Sorry about that, son, said the older of the 2 corpsmen. We just had to be sure. It didn't occur to Jimmy to ask when the execution had taken place. Afterward, he realized it might have been years ago. What if the whole thing was fake? It could have been digital, at least the shots, the spurts of blood, the falling down. Maybe his mother was still alive. Maybe she was still at large. If so, what had he given away? The next few weeks were the worst that he could remember. Too many things were coming back to him, too much of what he'd lost or sadder had never had in the first place. All that wasted time, and he didn't even know who'd wasted it. He was angry most days. At first, he sought out his various lovers, but he was moody with them. He failed to be entertaining, and worse, he'd lost interest in sex. He stopped answering their e-messages. Is anything wrong? Was it something I did? How can I help? And didn't return their calls. Explaining wasn't worth it. In earlier days, he would have made his mother's death into a psychodrama, harvested some sympathy, but that wasn't what he wanted now. What did he want? He went to the compound single bar, no joy there. He already knew most of these women. He didn't need their neediness. He went back to internet porn, found it had lost its bloom. It was repetitive, mechanical, devoid of its earlier allure. He searched the web for the hot site, hoping that doing something familiar would help him feel less isolated, but it was defunct. He was drinking alone now at night, a bad sign. He shouldn't be doing that. It only depressed him, but he had to dull the pain. The pain of what? The pain of the raw, torn places, the damaged membranes where he'd wanged up against the great indifference of the universe. One big shark's mouth, the universe, row after row of razor-sharp teeth. He knew he was faltering, trying to keep his footing. Everything in his life was temporary, ungrounded. Language itself had lost its solidity. It had become thin, contingent, slippery, a viscid film on which he was sliding around like an eyeball on a plate, an eyeball that could still see, however, and that was the trouble. He remembered himself as carefree earlier in his youth, carefree, thick-skinned, skipping light-footed over the surfaces, whistling in the dark, able to get through anything, turning a blind eye, and now he found himself wincing away. The smallest setbacks were major, a lost sock, a jammed electrical toothbrush. Even the sunrise was blinding. He was being rubbed all over with sandpaper. Get a grip, he told himself. Get a handle on it. Put it behind you. Move forward. Make a new you. Such positive slogans. Such bland, inspirational promotion vomit. What he really wanted was revenge. But against whom and for what? Even if he had the energy for it, even if he could focus and aim, such a thing would be less than useless. On the worst nights, he'd call up Alex the parrot, long dead by then, but still walking and talking on the net, and watch him go through the paces. Handler, what color is the round ball, Alex? The round ball. Alex on the side thinking, blue. Handler, good boy. Alex, cork nut. Handler, there you are. And then Alex would begin a cob of baby corn, which wasn't what he'd asked for. He'd asked for an almond, and seeing this would bring tears to Jimmy's eyes. And then he'd stay up too late, and once in bed, he'd stare at the ceiling, telling over his list of obsolete words for the comfort that was in them. Dibble, aphasia, breast plow, enigma, gat. If Alex the parrot were his, they'd be friends, they'd be brothers. He'd teach him more words. Nell, kern, alack. But there was no longer any comfort in the words. There was nothing in them. It no longer delighted Jimmy to possess these small collections of letters that other people had forgotten about. It was like having his own baby teeth in a box. At the edge of a sleep procession would appear behind his eyes, moving out of the shadows to the left, crossing his field of vision, young slender girls with small hands, ribbons in their hair, bearing garlands of many-colored flowers. The field would be green, but it wasn't a pastoral scene. These were girls in danger, in need of rescue. There was something, a threatening presence behind the trees. Or perhaps the danger was in him. Perhaps he was the danger, a fanged animal gazing out from the shadowy cave of the space inside his own skull. Or it might be that the girls themselves were dangerous. There was always that possibility. They could be bait, a trap. He knew they were much older than they appeared to be and much more powerful as well. Unlike himself, they had ruthless wisdom. The girls were calm. They were grave and ceremonious. They'd look at him. They'd look into him and they'd recognize and accept him, accept his darkness, and then they would smile. Oh, honey, I know you. I see you. I know what you want.